He was born into darkness, yet destined to chase the light. In 1818, in the state of Maryland, a child named Frederick Douglass came into a world where freedom was a distant dream. He did not know the comfort of a family, the sound of his mother's voice beyond a few stolen moments, or even his exact birthday. From the very beginning, his life was defined by what he was denied: identity, education, and the most basic right to call himself free. The plantation was his first classroom, and cruelty his first lesson. Children like Frederick were not taught to read or write. They were taught obedience. Knowledge was considered dangerous, something that could awaken the mind and lead to questions no one in power wanted to answer. And yet, even as Frederick sensed that the world was bigger than the fields he worked in. Somewhere beyond the fences and the fear, there was something called freedom, and he wanted it more than anything. When he saw white children holding books, he watched closely. He memorized letters, sounds, and shapes, piecing together the language that could one day unlock his mind. Every scrap of paper became a secret weapon, every word a silent rebellion. The more he learned, the more he understood the cruel truth. Education was not just power, it was liberation. But knowledge came with a cost. The more Douglass knew, the more he suffered. He began to see the full weight of the injustice around him. Still, he refused to surrender his spirit. Even when the system tried to break him, even when his body ached from labor and punishment, his mind refused to bow. Frederick Douglass's story is not only about one man's journey from slavery to scholarship, it is the story of how courage, intellect, and hope can defy an entire system built on oppression. It is a reminder that even in the darkest corners of history, human dignity can rise, learn, and lead. As we explore his incredible transformation from a boy forbidden to learn to one of the most powerful voices for freedom in American history, you will witness how words became his weapon and truth became his legacy. If stories like this inspire you, stories of resilience, of people who changed the world through strength and knowledge, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder of what determination can achieve. Because this is not just history, it is a living lesson that echoes today. The story of Frederick Douglass teaches us that no matter where you begin, no matter what chains hold you back, your mind, your voice, and your courage can change everything. Frederick Douglass grew up in a world that sought to keep him silent, a world where words themselves were forbidden treasures. On the plantation, he was surrounded by the rhythms of labor, the sound of tools striking soil, the weary sighs of people who had forgotten what hope sounded like. Yet amid the noise of that life, there was a quieter, more dangerous sound that stirred within him, the whisper of curiosity. He could not explain it then, but something inside him refused to accept that he was meant to live and die without knowing why. When Douglass was sent to Baltimore as a young boy, the world around him began to shift. The city was still harsh, but it offered glimpses of something new: streets lined with shops, people reading newspapers, children carrying books. It was there that he first encountered the mystery of written language. His mistress, Auld, showed him the alphabet, tracing letters on paper with a gentle patience that startled him. For the first time, someone saw him not as property, but as a boy capable of learning. Those lessons were brief, but they changed everything. In those simple letters, Frederick discovered a door, a way out of the silence he had always known. When Auld found out, he was furious. He warned his wife that teaching a boy like Frederick to read would ruin him, that knowledge would make him unfit to serve. But those angry words had the opposite effect. They revealed a truth Frederick would never forget, that education was power, and that power was the one thing the world around him feared most. From that moment, he understood that every letter he learned, every word he read, was an act of quiet defiance. Without teachers or books of his own, Frederick created his own path. He carried a small spelling book in secret and made friends with poor white children in the streets, trading bits of bread for lessons. He watched them write their names, then copied them in the dirt until he could do it too. Sometimes he would challenge them, pretending not to know a word just to see if they could outsmart him. They rarely did. Slowly, painfully, he pieced together the foundation of literacy, one letter, one phrase, one forbidden truth at a time. Reading opened his eyes, but it also burdened his heart. Through discarded newspapers and old schoolbooks, he began to see the world as it truly was, a world where injustice was not natural, but constructed. He read about freedom, about abolition, about men who spoke out against the very system that bound him. Every word cut deeper than the last, but they also gave him strength. He realized that ignorance had been the chain all along, and that knowledge was the key that could break it. At night, while others slept, Frederick would whisper words to himself under the faint glow of the moon, repeating lines he had memorized from scraps of text. Each sentence became a promise, each word a step toward the man he would become. There were moments of fear, times when discovery would have meant punishment, but the hunger for learning was stronger than the fear itself. It was as if the letters themselves had taken root inside him, growing quietly, unstoppable. The more he learned, the more restless he became. The world of words gave him new eyes, but it also made the life around him unbearable. He began to dream of something he had never seen but could now imagine clearly: freedom. Books taught him not just how to read but how to think, how to question, how to believe that life could be different. The speeches and essays he read spoke of liberty and equality, and though he was still trapped by circumstance, his mind was already free. Years later, Douglass would write that literacy was both a blessing and a curse. It showed him the beauty of possibility, but also the weight of reality. Knowing the world's injustices did not make them easier to endure, but it made him determined to change them. That inner fire, sparked by letters and words, became the foundation of his future voice, the voice that would one day shake the conscience of a nation. He understood now that freedom was not simply the absence of chains. It was the presence of knowledge, of thought, of the ability to define oneself. As he grew, so did his conviction that no human being was born to live in ignorance. He began to see education as a sacred act, a reclamation of humanity itself. The young boy who once traced letters in the dirt had become a man who carried words like armor. Though the world around him tried to dictate his place, his literacy gave him the power to write his own destiny. With each page he turned, each sentence he composed in his mind, Frederick Douglass was already rewriting history, his own and that of countless others who had been silenced. And it all began with a spark of curiosity, a single act of forbidden learning, and the courage to believe that the human spirit could not be chained forever. From those quiet moments in the streets of Baltimore, a new voice was born, one that would rise, speak, and echo through generations. The hunger for freedom that had begun with the discovery of letters soon grew into something larger, something that could no longer be contained within the pages of a book. Frederick Douglass had learned to read the world as clearly as the words he once whispered in secret, and what he saw filled him with both clarity and anger. Knowledge had opened his mind, but it had also made his captivity unbearable. The more he understood, the more he realized how deeply the system around him was built to crush the very thing that made him human, his will. It was during this time, when his mind was awakening but his body was still bound, that Douglass was sent to live under the control of Edward Covey, a man known across the region for his reputation as a slave breaker. Covey's name carried the weight of fear, whispered among those who had felt the sting of his methods. He was a man who claimed to correct disobedience through relentless labor and intimidation. For many who passed through his hands, the result was submission. But for Douglass, The experience would ignite the most defining battle of his life. From the moment he arrived, the rules of Covey's farm were clear. Work from dawn until exhaustion. Obey without question. And never forget your place. The first days passed in a haze of sweat and silence, every breath heavy with resentment. The fields stretched endlessly beneath the sun, and every hour tested the limits of his endurance. Yet within Douglass, something had changed. He was no longer a boy who accepted his fate. He was a man who had tasted the power of knowledge, and with it came the realization that his spirit was his own. Covey prided himself on breaking that spirit. He used deceit as often as the whip, appearing suddenly from behind trees, catching his laborers off guard, hoping to breed constant fear. Douglass endured this cycle of humiliation and violence until his body could take no more. But even as his strength faltered, his mind refused to yield. Each act of cruelty deepened his resolve. Each day of pain reminded him of what he was fighting for, not just survival, but dignity. One hot summer afternoon, the tension reached its breaking point. Exhausted and pushed beyond endurance, Douglass was attacked by Covey, who struck him without warning. The blows came fast, fueled by rage and control. But this time, Douglass did not fall to his knees. He fought back. What began as a moment of desperation became a struggle for his very humanity. For 2 hours, they wrestled in the dirt, the sounds of their struggle echoing through the fields. Covey called for help, but none came. The fight ended not with surrender, but with silence, and in that silence, Douglass stood victorious. He had not destroyed his oppressor, but he had reclaimed himself. That moment marked the turning point of his life. Though still bound by law, he knew he was free in a way that no man could take from him again. The fight with Covey was more than a physical confrontation. It was a battle of will, of spirit, of self-recognition. Douglass would later write that it was on that day he became a man. He had been tested in the most brutal way, and instead of breaking, he discovered a strength he never knew he possessed. In the days that followed, Covey never tried to strike him again. Something had shifted in the balance of power between them. It was not that Douglass had gained physical dominance, but that he had proved himself unbreakable. The illusion of total control had shattered. Others noticed it too: the quiet confidence in his posture, the steadiness in his eyes. He had confronted fear itself and survived. That knowledge became a kind of armor, invisible but impenetrable. The rest of his time on Covey's farm passed without further violence. But the scars of those months stayed with him. They were not just reminders of pain, but of transformation. Covey had tried to erase his spirit and instead had sharpened it. Through suffering, Douglass learned that resistance was not only possible but necessary. He carried that lesson with him for the rest of his life. Looking back, Douglass would see that experience as the crucible in which his future was forged. It was there, in the fields of Maryland, under the relentless sun, that he began to understand what true freedom meant. It was not merely the absence of chains, but the refusal to accept one's own degradation. That realization became the foundation of his purpose, the belief that no human being should live without dignity. That submission to injustice is the slow death of the soul. He had entered Covey's farm as a man stripped of hope, but he left with something far greater than fear. The act of standing up, of refusing to be broken, transformed him. It was as though every word he had ever read, every secret lesson he had learned, came alive in that moment of defiance. The education he had once pursued in whispers now spoke through his actions, through the simple truth that courage could defy cruelty. Years later, when Frederick Douglass spoke before audiences, people were drawn not only to his eloquence, but to the quiet power behind his words, the authority of someone who had faced the depths of human oppression and risen above it. The battle with Edward Covey had not just shaped his character, it had revealed his destiny. It taught him that freedom begins long before one escapes physical bondage. It begins the moment a person decides that their spirit will no longer yield. And so, the boy who once traced letters in secret and dreamed of a life beyond the plantation now stood as a living testament to the strength of the human will. The struggle with Covey was not simply a chapter in his story, it was the moment the story truly began. When Frederick Douglass ceased to be a victim and became a symbol of resilience for generations to come. Freedom had long existed in Frederick Douglass's mind before it ever reached his hands. After the battle with Edward Covey, something within him had changed forever. He had proven that his body could be punished but not conquered, and that his mind was beyond reach. Yet knowing he was free in spirit was not enough. His heart yearned for the real thing. Each sunrise over the fields reminded him of the world beyond them, the one he had only read about in newspapers and heard whispered among others who dreamed of escape. The thought of liberty consumed him, filling every quiet moment with restlessness. Douglass had learned that rebellion could take many forms. Sometimes it was the swing of a fist, and sometimes it was the quiet act of planning. In secret, he began to study the routes northward, memorizing names of towns, train schedules, and the habits of those who traveled freely. Every detail mattered. He knew the risk was enormous. One mistake could cost him everything. But after years of endurance, he had reached a point where staying was no longer living. The decision was not made in a burst of impulse but in the slow, burning certainty that freedom was worth any cost. There were moments when he almost abandoned the idea. The stories of capture and punishment haunted him, and fear lingered like a shadow that would not leave. Yet, even fear began to lose its hold on him. He had already faced what most men could not survive. Now, he had only one thing left: to claim his right to live as his own man. When opportunity came, he was ready. In the stillness of a September morning in 1838, Frederick Douglass set his plan in motion. Dressed in a sailor's uniform borrowed from a trusted friend, he carried forged papers that identified him as a free seaman traveling to New York. The disguise was simple but brilliant, for sailors moved freely between states, often without question. The moment he stepped onto the train, his pulse quickened. Every sound around him felt amplified: the clatter of wheels, the murmur of passengers, the conductor's footsteps echoing down the aisle. He sat quietly, eyes lowered, hands steady, even as his heart raced. Each station he passed brought both relief and terror. He knew that a single suspicious glance, a single wrong question could expose him. When the conductor approached, Douglass handed over his papers with calm precision, praying that his voice would not tremble. The man looked briefly at the documents, nodded, and moved. It was a small moment, but it felt like the turning of fate itself. Douglass remained still, barely breathing, until the train began to move again. He was crossing invisible borders, now each mile carrying him closer to a world he had only imagined. As the hours passed, the tension grew heavier. He transferred between trains and ferries, blending into the flow of travelers. There were moments when suspicion flickered in someone's eyes, and Douglass would steady himself, answering briefly and confidently, as if he had nothing to hide. Every passing hour felt like a lifetime. He thought of the people he had left behind, those still bound by chains and silence, and of the risk he was taking not only for himself, but for the hope of all who dreamed as he did. When he finally stepped onto the streets of New York City, the air felt different. The noise of the city was overwhelming: horses, wagons, shouts of vendors, but beneath it all was a sound he had never truly heard before. The quiet hum of freedom. For the first time, there was no overseer's voice, no command dictating his every move. Yet the moment was not one of celebration but disbelief. After years of imagining liberty, he found it difficult to grasp that it was real. He walked through the crowded streets, cautious and alert, half expecting someone to call out his name. But no one did. The world moved on around him, indifferent to the miracle that had just occurred. Still, Freedom was not without fear. New York was filled with men who hunted escaped people for money. And Douglass knew that even a single mistake could send him back to the life he had fled. He moved carefully, finding shelter with those who supported the cause of abolition. They offered him safety, guidance, and a new name. In that moment, the boy who had once learned letters in secret and fought for his dignity on Covey's farm became something new, a man free in both body and soul. He began to reflect on the journey that had brought him here, the forbidden lessons of literacy, the fight for his own humanity, the courage to defy a system that thrived on fear. Each step had been a lesson, each hardship a teacher. Freedom was not just the absence of bondage. It was the sum of all those moments when he chose to resist, to learn, to stand. He understood now that liberty carried its own responsibilities. It demanded purpose. It called for a voice. In the weeks that followed, Douglass began to dream again. But this time his dreams were larger than his own survival. He saw education as the great equalizer, truth as the weapon that could shatter the lies holding so many captive. He knew that his life could no longer be lived in silence. Though he had escaped the fields, he had not escaped the cause. Freedom had given him not rest, but a mission. As he looked toward the horizon, Douglass realized that the same courage that had guided him through the shadow of Covey's whip and the peril of his escape would now lead him to a new kind of fight, the fight to awaken others. The sailor's disguise had carried him to safety, but his true transformation was just beginning. He had crossed not only a border, but a threshold between two worlds, the one that bound him and the one he would help to change. From that moment on, Frederick Douglass was no longer a man fleeing the past. He was a man walking toward the future, carrying with him the unbreakable truth he had earned. That freedom, once seized, demands to be shared. The years that followed Douglass' daring escape were filled with uncertainty and quiet resolve. Though he had crossed the invisible line between bondage and freedom, he knew that true safety was still a distant dream. The fugitive slave laws meant that even in the North, danger could lurk behind any knock at the door. But instead of hiding in fear, Douglass made a choice that would define his life. He decided to use his voice. It started almost by accident. In small gatherings organized by abolitionists, he was encouraged to share his story. His hands would tremble at first, his heart racing as he faced an audience of free men and women who had never known the darkness he had endured. Yet as he spoke, the words began to flow with the clarity of truth and the rhythm of conviction. The pain he once buried deep became a weapon of understanding, a bridge between two worlds, the enslaved and the free. Word spread quickly. Those who heard him speak were struck not just by the power of his story, but by the dignity and intelligence with which he told it. His command of language, honed in secret through years of forbidden reading, set him apart. He was not simply recounting events. He was exposing the moral contradictions of a nation that called itself free while binding millions in chains. His voice rose above the din of complacency, forcing listeners to confront what they preferred to ignore. The young man who had once risked everything for literacy now wielded it as his greatest tool for liberation. Invitations began to pour in from across the northern states. He joined forces with abolitionist leaders who recognized his gift. And soon, his name appeared on pamphlets and flyers announcing lectures that drew crowds by the hundreds. In churches, schoolhouses, and public halls, Douglass spoke of the realities of enslavement not as distant history, but as a living wound upon the soul of America. His speeches were not fiery condemnations. They were deliberate, reasoned appeals to conscience. He wanted his listeners not just to feel pity, but to understand the urgency of change. Every word he spoke was a challenge to the audience to see beyond race, beyond economics, beyond the comfort of silence. Yet his success came with new challenges. Some doubted that a man who had endured such oppression could be so eloquent. They accused him of fabrication, claiming his speeches were too refined to come from someone once enslaved. Rather than being discouraged, Douglass saw this disbelief as proof of how little people understood about human potential. He decided to write his own story, every hardship, every moment of defiance, so that no one could question its truth. The result was his first autobiography, a book that would shake the conscience of the nation and affirm his place as one of the most powerful voices of his time. When the book was published, the reaction was immediate. Admirers praised his courage and eloquence, while enemies denounced him as a threat to the established order. His identity, once hidden for his own safety, was now laid bare on every page. This made him vulnerable to those who wished to silence him, and for a time, he left the country, traveling to Britain and Ireland, where he found audiences eager to hear his message. There, he experienced something he had never known before: true equality. For the first time, he walked streets where no one questioned his worth, where his humanity was not defined by the color of his skin. The experience deepened his conviction that change was possible, that the chains binding his people were not inevitable, but constructed by human hands, and therefore could be broken by human will. When he returned to America, it was with renewed purpose. He purchased his freedom legally to ensure he could continue his work without fear of recapture. And he threw himself fully into the movement for abolition. His home became a gathering place for reformers and a safe haven for those fleeing bondage. Through his speeches, writings, and later his own newspaper, he gave voice to those who had been silenced for generations. Each appearance, each publication was a strike against ignorance and indifference. But beyond the public acclaim, Douglass carried a quiet, unshakable sense of duty. He knew his story was not his alone, it was the story of millions. He often reflected on how far he had come, from a boy secretly tracing letters in the dust to a man whose words now reached across oceans. And yet, he never allowed himself to forget those still trapped in the system he had escaped. His mission was not complete until freedom and dignity were universal truths, not privileges reserved for a few. As the movement for abolition grew, Douglass' influence expanded beyond activism. He became a symbol of resilience, intellect, and moral clarity. To many, he was living proof that education and determination could overcome even the harshest circumstances. To others, he was a challenge, a mirror held up to a society that claimed to be just. Through it all, he remained steadfast, never allowing fame or recognition to dull the fire that had guided him since childhood, the belief that words could set people free. Every time he took the stage, every sentence he wrote, Douglass carried with him the memory of those who could not speak for themselves. His oratory was not merely performance, it was purpose made flesh. The journey from the shadows of oppression to the spotlight of reform had transformed him, but it had not changed his heart. He remained the same boy who once saw the alphabet as a ladder to freedom, now standing at its peak, extending his hand to others who still stood at the bottom, urging them upward toward the light. When Frederick Douglass finally decided to tell his story in full, he did so with the same courage that had carried him from captivity to freedom. The result was a book unlike anything America had seen before, a work that tore away the veil of myth and denial surrounding slavery. Titled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, it was not just an autobiography. It was an unflinching testament to truth, written by a man who had lived through the very institution he now sought to dismantle. Every page carried the weight of his memory, each sentence sharpened by the pain of experience. He wrote not to elicit pity, but to reveal the cost of a system that treated human beings as property. When the book was published in 1845, its impact was immediate and profound. Readers who had never set foot on a plantation suddenly found themselves face to face with the human reality behind the word slavery. Douglass's prose was clear, vivid, and deliberate, each detail chosen to pierce the conscience of a nation. He described the harshness of labor, the cruelty of overseers, and the psychological chains that bound both the oppressed and their oppressors. But beyond the suffering, there was also defiance, the spark of intellect and will that no amount of control could extinguish. His words carried not only sorrow, but also strength, reminding readers that even in the darkest places, the human spirit sought light. The response to the book was explosive. Abolitionists hailed it as one of the most powerful indictments of slavery ever written. It became a rallying cry, passed from hand to hand in churches, universities, and private homes. For those who had doubted that a man once enslaved could possess such command of language, the narrative shattered their prejudice. It forced Americans and indeed the world to confront the hypocrisy of a society that prided itself on liberty while perpetuating bondage. Every page was a challenge to the comfortable illusions of the time, exposing the distance between the ideals of freedom and the reality of human exploitation. Yet with fame came danger. Douglass had used his real name, and the publication of his story made his location known. The fugitive slave laws still hung over his head, and his former enslaver had every legal right to reclaim him. The very success of the narrative threatened to undo his freedom. Friends and allies urged him to leave the country, and he reluctantly agreed. In 1845, he set sail for Britain, carrying with him little more than a few clothes and the manuscript that had already begun to reshape history. In England, Scotland, and Ireland, Douglass found himself embraced in a way that astonished him. Crowds filled lecture halls to hear him speak. There, he was not seen as an escaped slave, but as a man, a thinker, a reformer, a voice of conscience. The warmth of that welcome stirred something deep within him. For the first time, he experienced a society where his color did not determine his worth. The contrast between his reception abroad and his treatment in America only strengthened his resolve. He spoke tirelessly about the moral contradiction that lay at the heart of his homeland, a country that proclaimed liberty while silencing millions. His eloquence captured the imagination of the British public, and many rallied to his cause, raising funds to secure his legal freedom so he could return home as a free man in both spirit and law. When Douglass came back to the United States, he returned not just as a survivor, but as a force of change. The success of his narrative had made him a symbol, a living testament to what education, courage, and conviction could achieve. He continued to write, to lecture, and to inspire, using every platform available to him to press the case for justice. His home became a meeting place for reformers, a hub of discussion and planning for those who refused to accept the moral blindness of their era. Through his words, the movement for abolition gained not only momentum but a human face. The influence of Douglass' narrative spread far beyond his own lifetime. It became a cornerstone of abolitionist literature, translated into multiple languages, studied by scholars, and quoted by leaders. His power lay not in embellishment but in authenticity. Douglass had written the truth as he lived it, and that truth could not be denied. His writing bridged the gap between the oppressed and the free, allowing readers to see, perhaps for the first time, that freedom was not merely the absence of chains, but the recognition of shared humanity. As his reputation grew, Douglass reflected often on what the book had meant not only to his readers, but to himself. Writing it had been an act of liberation, another kind of escape. He had broken the silence that slavery imposed, reclaiming his story from those who had once claimed his body. In giving voice to his past, he ensured that it could no longer define his future. The book had transformed him from fugitive to leader, from survivor to symbol. It was proof that the written word, when wielded with truth, could be more powerful than any weapon. Even decades later, Douglass would look back on that first narrative as the moment his life took on its fullest purpose. It was more than a memoir. It was a declaration of existence, a demand that the world recognize the humanity of those it had sought to erase. He understood that by telling his story, he had opened the door for others to tell theirs. The boy who once risked punishment to learn the alphabet had become a man whose words could not be silenced. Through his writing, he had turned pain into power, memory into movement, and his own struggle into a mirror that reflected the conscience of a nation. His narrative remains, even now, a living document, a reminder of how truth, when spoken with courage, can outlast fear, and how one voice, when lifted with conviction, can echo through generations long after its time. As Frederick Douglass' influence spread across America and beyond, he refused to be confined to a single cause. The fight against slavery had defined his early mission. But Douglass understood that true freedom extended far beyond emancipation. The end of bondage was not the end of inequality, and liberty meant little without education, justice, and dignity for all. He had lived long enough to see that oppression had many faces, some wearing the chains of labor, others bound by ignorance, prejudice, or silence. And so, he widened his struggle, stepping into a new chapter of his life as one of the most respected reformers of the 19th century. Even after the abolition of slavery, Douglass' days were filled with speeches, writings, and debates that addressed the deeper wounds of society. He saw that ignorance was still a prison, and that education remained the surest path to progress. Remembering how forbidden words had once been his salvation, he made it his mission to promote learning for every child, regardless of race or gender. He often said that knowledge was the light that could banish the darkness of hatred and fear, and he dedicated himself to spreading that light wherever he could. Schools, newspapers, lecture halls, each became his battlefield, each a place where he could fight for minds as fiercely as he once fought for bodies. Douglass's vision of equality was broad and revolutionary for his time. He recognized that freedom must belong to everyone or it meant nothing at all. He spoke not only for the liberation of African Americans, but also for the empowerment of women. At a time when even many reformers dismissed women's demands for suffrage and autonomy, Douglass stood beside them. Unwavering, he believed that the right to vote, to learn, and to speak were sacred rights of every human being. When he attended the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, the first women's rights convention in American history, he stood among the few men present and lent his voice to the declaration of sentiments, supporting women's right to vote as essential to true democracy. To him, equality was indivisible. An injustice in one form was an injustice to all. His support for women's rights came not from ideology alone, but from empathy born of experience. He had seen what it meant to be denied agency, to have one's will suppressed, to be treated as property. Freedom, in his, could not be selective. It could not favor one gender or race over another. This belief set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Even within the abolitionist movement, he was not afraid to challenge allies when their vision of justice fell short. His courage in standing for universal equality made him a bridge between movements, a man who could connect struggles that others saw as separate. Douglass's commitment to education remained unwavering. He used his platform to advocate for schools, vocational training, and access to higher learning for newly freed men and women. He saw education as both shield and sword, protecting individuals from exploitation while empowering them to claim their rightful place in society. In his speeches, he urged young people to cultivate both intellect and character, reminding them that freedom was not just a gift won in war but a responsibility carried in peace. His words inspired generations of teachers, ministers, and leaders who looked to him not just as a symbol of survival, but as a blueprint for advancement. Despite the many honors he received in his later years, Douglass never allowed comfort to silence him. He understood that progress was fragile and that every gain could be undone by complacency. He warned against the illusion that the work was finished, that equality had been achieved. Slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot, he once said, and even then, he knew that prejudice did not disappear with the stroke of a pen. Through his later writings and editorials, he confronted racial discrimination in employment, housing, and politics, challenging a society that still struggled to live up to its own ideals. His words were not just calls to action, they were challenges to conscience. As Douglass aged, his presence carried the weight of history. He had once been a fugitive who risked everything for a taste of freedom. Now he was an advisor to presidents and a symbol of America's capacity for change. He served in public office, representing his country abroad and championing civil rights at home. Yet, even amid recognition, he remained grounded in purpose. His speeches continued to stir crowds, not with bitterness but with clarity, reminding listeners that the moral test of any nation lies in how it treats its weakest and most forgotten citizens. Those who met him in person often described his commanding voice and piercing gaze, the combination of intellect and moral fire that made him unforgettable. But those who read his words spread through his newspapers and books found something equally powerful, a relentless faith in the possibility of human progress. Douglass believed that people could change, that education could awaken empathy, and that justice, though delayed, could triumph. This faith was not naive. It was hard-earned through struggle and sorrow. By the time he entered his later years, Frederick Douglass had become more than a reformer. He was a conscience for a nation still learning what freedom truly meant. He had fought for the enslaved, the disenfranchised, the uneducated, and the unseen. His legacy was not confined to one movement or one era. It lived in every classroom that opened its doors to all children, in every ballot cast by those once silenced, and in every voice that dared to speak truth to power. His life's journey from forbidden literacy to eloquent leadership stood as living proof that the pursuit of knowledge and justice could outlast the cruelty of any system. He never stopped reminding his country that equality was not a gift to be granted by the powerful, but a right to be claimed by all. And though his body grew old, his spirit never did. To the very end, he carried within him that same restless hunger for freedom that had once driven a young boy to steal moments of learning in secret. In his final years, as he stood before audiences filled with people of every background, he spoke not just of what he had endured, but of what humanity could become. His words echoed with both warning and hope, reminding all who listened that liberty, like light, must be guarded, shared, and passed on so that no one would ever again have to fight for the right simply to be free. From the beginning, Frederick Douglass's life seemed written in the language of loss of family, freedom, and identity. Yet by the end, his story had transformed into one of the most extraordinary testaments to human resilience ever told. He began as a child denied his own name and education, and he rose to become one of America's greatest thinkers, reformers, and voices of conscience. His journey was not simply from slavery to freedom, it was from silence to speech, from ignorance to enlightenment, from the chains of the past to the open fields of possibility. Douglass's power came not from wealth or privilege, but from conviction. He believed that the mind, once awakened, could never again be enslaved. The alphabet he learned in secret as a child became the foundation of an intellect that challenged presidents, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens to look inward. His pen struck harder than any weapon, and his words carried a force that transcended time and place. Through them, he reminded the world that true strength lies not in domination, but in understanding, not in cruelty, but in compassion. Even in his later years, when many would have rested on the laurels of fame, Douglass remained a restless soul. He saw injustice not as an isolated evil of the past, but as a living danger that could return in new forms if left unchallenged. He spoke out against discrimination wherever he found it, whether in education, work, or the ballot box. His message never changed. Freedom was not complete until every person could stand equal before the law, and in the eyes of their fellow citizens. And though the path toward that vision was long and uncertain, Douglass walked it with unshakable faith. He once said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." Those words became a guiding principle, not only for his generation but for all who would follow. They remind us that freedom is not a gift handed down, it is a right fought for, guarded, and renewed by each new heart that dares to care. Douglass' life embodied that truth. He did not wait for change to find him. He became the change he wished to see. In doing, he left behind more than speeches and books. He left a map for moral courage. By the time he passed away in 1895, Douglass had witnessed a nation transformed, yet still incomplete. He had seen the legal end of slavery and the beginning of Reconstruction, the rise of new opportunities, and the persistence of old hatreds. But he never lost hope in the American promise. He believed that a country capable of such great wrong was also capable of great redemption. His faith in democracy, in education, and in human decency never wavered, even when tested by disappointment. He believed that knowledge could dismantle prejudice, and that truth could dissolve fear. And he proved, through his own example, that moral strength can outlast oppression. Today, his legacy stands not only in statues or history books, but in the very idea that one person armed only with words and conviction can reshape the conscience of a nation. His voice still calls out from the pages of his writings, urging us to see one another not through the lens of difference, but through the shared dignity of humanity. When we read his speeches or recall his story, we are reminded that freedom is both fragile and eternal, and that our responsibility is to keep its flame alive. Frederick Douglass' journey teaches us that the greatest battles are not fought on fields or in courts, but within the soul, between ignorance and understanding, between silence and truth. He rose from a world that sought to erase him, and in doing so, became impossible to forget. His life remains proof that courage and intellect can move the world forward, one voice at a time. So as we close this story, remember what Douglass's life represents: the power of learning, the importance of standing firm in what is right, and the unbreakable belief that change begins with a single act of defiance against despair. His legacy does not belong to the past, it belongs to everyone who still believes in the possibility of progress, in the promise of equality, and in the strength of the human spirit to rise again and again, no matter how many times it is pushed down. If this story has moved you, if it reminds you of the strength that lies within knowledge, hope, and compassion, then take a moment to keep that spirit alive. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this story with others who believe that history's lessons still matter today. Because the fight for freedom and equality did not end with Frederick Douglass, it continues in every act of understanding, every voice raised for justice, and every heart that chooses to see humanity in all its colors.